Welcome. My name is Sebastian von Einsiedel. I'm the director of the Center for Policy Research at United Nations University. It's my distinct pleasure to be sitting here with Colin Keating for this UNU video interview on geopolitics and the Security Council. And I can't think of anyone, and I mean this quite literally, who can speak about the Council with greater authority than Colin Keating. Indeed, few people have had a front row seat in observing and a direct role in shaping the actions of the Security Council for as long as Colin has. In 1993 and 94, he served as New Zealand's ambassador to the Security Council. In that role, he held the Security Council's rotating presidency in April 1994, when the Rwandan genocide broke. Unfortunately, his brave and urgent efforts to muster a council response to the unfolding genocide ran up against forces beyond his control. Between 2005 and 2011, he served as the founding executive director of Security Council Report, a magnificent NGO monitoring the Security Council and making the body at least somewhat more transparent. And a couple of years after stepping down from that role, he successfully led New Zealand's campaign for another stint as a non-permanent member on the Security Council, and then served as New Zealand's advisor for its council term in 2015 and 2016. Colin, welcome to UNU.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. It's great to be here in Tokyo with you. Great.
Colin, I'm sure you would agree it's hard to argue that the Council is doing very well these days. Its permanent 5 members are divided. The Council is deadlocked on a number of crises, first and foremost Syria. The number of vetoes, in particular Russian ones, are up. How concerned are you about the return to Cold War paralysis in the Security Council?
Well, I think there's a big difference from the Cold War, and that is that the paralysis is not driven so much by ideology. It's driven much more by sharply defined national interests, which have been exposed in much more in the last decade. So I think we have quite often a conscious choice to make the Security Council more of a rhetorical place, a place in which there is political theatre and political obstruction, much less in the way of concrete, practical, collective effort to resolve problems. And I think we therefore have an institution, an opportunity, which is significantly underutilized as a result. This is always a bad thing. It is a particularly bad thing when there are so many conflicts in the world that could actually be assisted by an active cooperative Security Council. But it's particularly dangerous at a time in which there is quite significant geo-strategic stress that we haven't seen for a very long time.
How is this geostrategic stress playing out in the Security Council?
Well, geostrategic stress is stress. I mean, it's like environmental stress, it's like biological stress. It's one of those things that can kill you. But equally, it's one of those things which, if diagnosed early and treated early with intervention and care, can it be attenuated? You can roll back stress. It doesn't have to happen. And a lot of the events that have occurred over the course of the last decade didn't have to happen if there had been more commitment to prevention, to early diagnosis of problems, and the international community would be much more effective. It would be much less expensive to deal with these problems up front and not be an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff with thousands of peacekeepers trying to put back together dreadful humanitarian situations.
I will come back to the question of prevention in a moment, but before I wanted to ask you, how is the rise of China affecting dynamics in the Security Council?
Well, I think it's been a steady increase in Chinese interest in the United Nations institutions of power. As China has become more powerful, it has wanted to play a more powerful role in the United Nations institutions. Sometimes this plays out for good, and we see a much larger Chinese commitment to United Nations peacekeeping, which didn't used to happen. And there's some positives in that. We also, I think, see some negatives. There is often a sense in Beijing that the United Nations shouldn't engage in dealing with issues that might arise of a domestic conflict nature when there are civil wars. And so the anxiety about intrusion into sovereignty often prevails and prevails against the common good, and quite often against the Chinese own narrative that one should solve problems by peaceful means, by mediation, by the use of Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter rather than the forceful instruments of Chapter 7. And yet so often there is this contradiction which leads China to take negative positions with respect to the early action, the early intervention of a political kind that would prevent and obviate the need for sanctions or peacekeeping at a later stage. And as China has become more involved, this has become more complex. I think it's interesting, though, to see how China is nevertheless open to persuasion. Particularly, for instance, you see this often in Africa. If the African countries are keen that there should be a United Nations engagement and intervention, a peacekeeping mission, then it is very, very rare that China will go against Africa. So I think we're seeing quite a lot of very interesting developments that don't all pull in the same direction.
Great. Fascinating. Colin, we are here in Tokyo. The North Korean nuclear crisis is, of course, high on many people's minds around the world, but in particular here. How are current geopolitical dynamics in the Council playing out on that crisis?
Well, I think the Council is very much stuck in a track that has been set for a decade or so, which is a track of punitive sanctions designed to impose pressure for North Korea to give up its nuclear ambitions. And this is a course which has been generally supported by the P5. It's been widely supported by the elected members of the Council. The particular cause of the stress that is being seen at the moment is the increasing realization and reality that course of action, of diplomacy, of pressure is not having the results which had been hoped for. And so there is a sense that time is running out on that particular sense of strategy, and therefore the sense of nervousness in not only in North Asia, but I think in Asia Pacific generally and globally is heightened. But we have to put this in some historical context. There is a track record of the Security Council being much more actively involved in more creative ways in this issue of the North Korean nuclear ambitions. We have to remember that in 1994 was another period of major geostrategic stress. I think a lot of people in the world don't understand how close things were to war in 1993, 94. I remember very intensely from having been on the Security Council myself at that time. But there was the threat of sanctions had a very important impact in terms of changing dynamics. And we now see what happened, that the Clinton administration engaged in a very intensive negotiation which produced an agreed framework for the termination of the North Korean nuclear weapon program. But within a few months of that agreement being signed, there was an election in the United States. There was a change of leadership of the Congress. There were conservatives who were very opposed to the agreement. And we found quite quickly a lot of the agreed understandings between the two parties were unable to be implemented. Particularly the United States funding for alternative energy sources was constrained by Congress, and the political warming that had been envisaged as a result of the agreed framework failed to happen. And of course, that then produced a completely tragic set of action and reaction by both parties. The Security Council sanctions came into play, and now of course it seems that the sanctions mechanism is less effective in reality than it had been in prospect. The strategic situation that exists at the moment is very, very dangerously balanced, and I think the Security Council could and should have played a much more important role back in 95, 96, 97, when it became clear that the agreed framework was unraveling. That was precisely the time that the Council should have stepped up and exercised its responsibility as a godfather of the agreement. We compare that with the situation that now exists with respect to the Iran nuclear deal that was done 2 years ago. I think what we're seeing, of course, is the reneging that is happening on the Iran deal from, again, a newly elected set of politicians in the United States. And of course, the messaging that sends cannot be helpful in the North Korea context either. But what's really interesting, I think, is whether or not the Security Council will also become engaged in a positive way in reinforcing and retaining the elements of the Iran nuclear deal. Now that's something that could be done that would send very positive signals.
Great, Colin, thank you. Slight shift of gears. Few issues have divided the Security Council as deeply over the past quarter century as the question of humanitarian intervention. And it's an issue you've, of course, as I mentioned at the outset, painfully lived through in '94 in the context of the Rwandan genocide. Now, in your assessment, has the Council's ability and willingness to address mass atrocities improved since Rwanda?
Well, I think the Council has to be given credit for its effort to improve the conceptual framework which underpins the concept of intervention to protect civilians. And I think we have seen a big development in the thematic program of the Security Council, which has created the intellectual, the conceptual framework which rationalizes, which legitimizes that source of action. What we have not seen is a parallel willingness to increase the practical intervention to make a difference. And when the practical interventions have occurred, they have often resulted in as many problems as they were designed to resolve. I think we need to be conscious of the fact that the intervention that was authorised with respect to Libya was an intervention that was designed to protect civilians, but it gradually escalated into an intervention of regime change. And I think that has had unfortunate consequences in terms of the acceptance of the international community generally of Western leadership on this issue of humanitarian intervention. And I think we have come a long way conceptually. We still have got quite far to go in terms of the actual mechanics of doing it. We have the theory of responsibility to protect, and I'm often intrigued by the initiative which at one stage Brazil championed, which they called responsibility while protecting, because I think that is the second limb which there has been insufficient attention to theory as well as practice.
Great. Colin, you've already mentioned a couple of times the importance of prevention. Now, many observers lament the Security Council's tendency to react to crises rather than to prevent them in the first place. Why is the Council so bad at prevention?
Prevention is hard, but we know from our normal human experience in the criminal justice sector, in the health sector, we know that an ounce of prevention is worth a bottle of cure. And we need to be very conscious of the resources, the capacity which is spent when a war breaks out, a society is devastated, and you have the needs of reconstruction. I saw just today the Secretary General's Special Representative for Syria estimating $50 to $60 billion just to make a beginning of reconstruction in Syria. Now, just imagine how much better it would have been to have prevented all that at the outset. What does it take to make a prevention? One actually has to invest in understanding the root causes of the conflict, and then bring together an integrated set of diplomatic, political, economic and social tools that will make a difference to respond to the grievances that are causing the outbreak of conflict in the first place. Now, surely it was not beyond the capacity of the members of the Security Council to diagnose those problems with respect to Syria in 2011 and make the necessary partnership with Russia in order to find solutions. But it would have required abandoning simplistic and I believe sometimes naive policy mantras such as Assad must go. Sure, Assad had to go, but there had to be, first of all, a negotiated transition. And if people had been willing to negotiate a 5-year transition in 2011, what are we now, 2017, and look what's happened in the interim.
Great, Colin. As I've mentioned at the outset, there are a few people who have observed the Council up close for as long as you have. Looking back at your stint in the Council in '93 and '94, and then more recently when you served as Special Advisor to New Zealand's non-permanent term in 2015 and 16, what has changed most in the way the Council operates on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think that takes us right back to your first question about the intensification of the political gap between the permanent members of the Security Council that now exists. That did not exist 20 years ago. There was an opportunity for the permanent members of the Security Council and the elected members in a much more equal way than is possible now to work in a cooperative way to discuss the causes of issues and to use the Council as best they could in a constructive way to address the problems given the tools that were available in 1993-94. I think now there is much less willingness to engage in genuine diagnosis of the natures of the problem, much less willingness to accommodate each other amongst the P5, and certainly much less willingness to give space for the 10 elected members of the Council to play any kind of leading role on any important issue. We find a desire for the permanent members to hold the pen, as they call it, which is a synonym for being the controlling presence with respect to a particular interest in which they feel they've got a national interest. And in effect converting the Security Council into an instrument of their national interest as opposed to a collective instrument which necessarily means accommodating the interests of others as well. And so we have a much less flexible Security Council. Its methods of work, its scheduling of its business, the role of its president have all been constrained by this much more difficult geostrategic situation that exists between the major powers.
Given the growing dominance and stranglehold of the permanent 5 members over Security Council business, how can elected members leave a mark during their 2-year stint?
Well, I think it's really very difficult at this point in time. It's never been easy because 2 years is a very short time to get up to speed with the issues, and it's certainly true that the workload in the Security Council has intensified. There is a much larger number of meetings, a much larger number of interactions, but that larger number of interactions is much less productive in terms of good outcomes for human beings than is desirable. So I think it's very difficult in a 2-year term to make a difference. It's really the critical thing to making a difference is being able to bring an independent perspective to bear, not only to the particular issues, but also to the relationships with the other council members, and to treat with respect the positions of all of the council members and bring them to agreement is as difficult now as it has ever been. I think there is an undeniable need to reform the Security Council, but reform doesn't just mean the number of countries and the presence of various permanent members or not permanent members. It's got more to do with the attitude and the culture and the capacity and the energy that people bring to the table. And at the moment, a lot of that is lacking, and a lot of the energy and enthusiasm that could be there is not there in the way that it was 2 decades ago.
Wonderful, Colin. We've come to the end of this interview. Thank you for being so insightful. It was a great pleasure to have you with us, and I'm sure our viewers will enjoy the interview as much as I did. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you very much to UNU for making this possible.